All right, folks. How y'all doing today? Probably can't see me because of the camera angle. I'll bring this bad boy down over here for a minute. Okay. Yeah, I hope y'all are having a fun day. Everybody hear me? Everything going okay? All right, we'll get some light here. Instead of like the blazing sunset behind me. I'll close that up real quick. Today we're going to talk about genres. So, genres for writers, I mean for music too, but really mostly for writers. Give me a second, I'm going to put this guitar down. Yeah, that way I don't have to like do the whole stream. You hear me like pecking away. This is a thing, like you put a guitar in my hands, and I'm like, okay. I just start playing, right? Like, I just start doing things. So, let me get it out of my hand so I can actually talk. Put that over there for now. All right. Okay. What do you need to know about genres? Let's take a look at the chat before we get started. Patreon.com/DavidVStewart. You can also hop on my mailing list, dvspress.com/free-book. That'll get you a free book. Yeah, baby. Free books are cool. People generally like free books. I'm not the only one who likes free books. I ended up on like a Simon & Schuster website, and I was like, they had a little pop-up like, get a free book. And I'm like, no, I can't be bothered. Can't be bothered with free books, actually. There's so many free books out there already. My voice is low. It's quiet. Interesting. Wonder what happened there. Give me a second. Check, check. Make sure this is actually plugged in right. Check, check. It's a little interesting. My voice is really low. Check, check. Yeah, it's showing really low on the monitor here for some reason. Give me a second. Live streams happen like this. It's actually plugged in properly. You never know. There could be like some kind of weird, like the system could be turning down the gain. So I'll check that real quick. This happens sometimes, you know. Windows decides that it's going to turn the gain down. Check, check. Yeah. Levels. How about now? There we go. Now it's blasting. Yeah. For some reason, Windows turned it down, which is a little weird because it should be an ASIO device. But there we go. Sometimes you get hiccups with the live show. It happens. I'm going to move my pedal board out of the way. Need to like get one of these new cheap Chinese ones and condense down a little bit. I have like a giant pedal board where I can experiment, like put all my pedals in different weird places. And that's really cool, except for the fact that it's really giant. And so when I want to like actually do something with the camera here, my autofocus is being a little weird. Hold on a second. Oh, there it goes. So when I want to actually do something with the camera, it gets a little bit, crazy. All right. So I don't know why Windows does that sometimes, turns down the volume of some audio devices. I don't get that. I don't get it. But anyway, now we're good. All right. So here we go. Let's begin. And let's talk a little bit about genres, what they are, and what you need to know about them as a writer, I guess as a musician as well. Oh yeah, I was going to look at the chat. YouTube's threatening to permanently block me from viewing 3 more videos because of ad blocking. I turn off ad block for YouTube. YouTube ads are, compared to other websites, they're much less intrusive. And they also fund the creator that you're looking at directly. Whereas most ads are, like, they don't even generate revenue when people look at them. Most ads. Like, most ads are really bad. Like, they just do a terrible job for anyone trying to run ads on your website. But not YouTube ads. They actually generate a lot of revenue for creators, so I leave them on. You just turn ad block off for the YouTube site. And otherwise, I leave it on. If I go to a site and they have a pop-up that says, turn off your ad blocker, I'll block the pop-up, or I will just navigate away. It's not worth my time to like expose my PC to the billions of scripts that you run with ads and make your website like unreadable with the ads when I can just block them. So people are like, is ad block stealing? I'm like, well, I'm not engaging in an agreement with you to watch things in exchange for advertisements, right? Like, I'm not signing something that says I agree to look at ads. So there's no contract between me and the people on the website. There's just kind of an implicit thing. And for a lot of websites, if your ads are unobtrusive, I'll probably turn off the ad blocker, right? I don't necessarily dislike seeing ads. Ads can be good or informative, but most of the time I block them because they make a website run like crap. You have a website that's basically a text document. It's a glorified text document with a couple images maybe. And it should not have to load 100 megabytes worth of information into my PC in order for me to look at it. But there's 100 megabytes of ads. That's a lot, guys. That means going through 7 websites, it's like you've looked at a whole gigabyte of information, right? Right? Your bandwidth. I mean, like, ads suck your bandwidth too. And most people have a bandwidth cap these days. So if you have a bandwidth cap, if your bandwidth cap is 1 terabyte and you're on the internet a lot, ads will suck it up, and it'll suck it up in ways you're like, where did all this go? How did I lose 100 gigabytes to looking at web pages last week? And the answer was ads, right? So I'm not into the awful ads that I see all the time. You got to get premium. Interesting drum. Thanks. Got to spice up them drums though. I have a lot of drum loops. Those are just like the basic ones I programmed recently. There's a lot of actually variations in those. I'll go over how I actually run them, because I run them as 2 separate things. Eventually, I'll do all the drums live as well as all the other instruments. But for now, because I've only been like really doing like the insane looping that I've been doing for a month or so, I got to kind of focus on like, can I manage all the guitar looping stuff? And there were some hiccups today too, because my foot switch for triggering like the end of a loop just doesn't work very well, and I'm having to basically come up with a MIDI solution, because normally the foot switch is going through my Appleton push. But we'll keep the drums simple for a bit. Better to have them simple than like have them be bad, in my opinion, right? Anyway, yeah, having to rely upon your music accompanying bids for rocking my bedtime hour. Thanks. All right, your voice is low. I think you mean quiet. Low is like low. Quiet is quiet. All right. It's not really true anymore. Ads will play on videos and not support the creator. There are channels I watch that are demonetized, but ads still play on them. Well, ads play on my videos, right? Ads play on my videos. I don't margin or batter ads. I tolerate the ads between paragraphs, but I detest pop-up ads. I hate pop-up ads, yeah. And I reserve a special hatred for autoplay visual ads, yeah. They're awful. If you made the ads less intrusive, no one would need an ad blocker if the ads were the equivalent of ads in the New York Times or like a magazine. Right? No one ran an ad blocker until they started running. Every ad was like a Flash applet that installed a virus on your computer, That's the way people get ads, by the way. Get viruses, by the way. Is like the ads run a script that install something on your computer without you knowing about it. That's how it was in the day anyways. So that's why we joke about like porn ads, is like someone would look at a porn website and then the ads would install a bunch of crap on their computer without them knowing about it. It'd be like a tracking cookie that's actually, its own little program. I tried looping or overdubbing my harmonica. Too much work for me. Well, one of my goals with what I'm doing is actually to perform the entirety of Terry Riley's In C, which is a famous minimalist composition, solo. It's usually for like 50 musicians, but I'm going to do it solo. And I think I can actually do a really good performance of it all by my lonesome. Though it will take a little bit more practice for me to master the software and the looping and the triggering of the looping, mainly cutting off the loops with a foot switch, being able to reliably do that, because right now it doesn't work super reliably. I hit the foot switch, it doesn't cut off, right? So I have to tweak it a little bit to make sure I have a better confirmation of what I'm doing. So I'll probably set up like some MIDI stuff to do a lot of that. But yeah, then do it all with guitar, EWI, keyboard, all that kind of stuff. So we'll do that. Yeah, some people say ads could be an art form in themselves. Yeah, they have to get your attention off of the words you're reading and look at the ad. And then I don't think ads are bad, and I think most people don't dislike ads if they're not really annoying and obtrusive the way that most modern ads are. So that's why people run ad blockers. Also, it's like it's running a script on your computer. People don't want that. So people run ad block for their basic protection, for security on their computer, not because they're trying to steal things from people. But they're not, and the New York Times might not run scripts on their ads. Great, but you're going to be visiting like a million other websites to find information that may run scripts, and that'll be super annoying. All right, let's get into what we're talking about today, which is genres. So what is a genre? What are genres? Genres are marketing terms. There is no hard and fast thing that clearly defines a genre. They are categories that are created mainly to direct consumers towards things that they want. So a book genre contains a whole set of things that readers have a reasonable expectation to see if they're buying something in that genre. That seems somewhat circular in the logic, right? Like we're not starting with the definition from the get-go. We're really starting with the expectations of the reader, and those are difficult. It's like mystery readers expect mystery stories when they pick up a mystery genre book, and mystery stories contain these elements and not these other elements. There's nothing that there's not a hard line around this is what mystery is and always will be, and it's like a spiritual category given by God, the way that trees and rocks are a category. So this is something that you have to keep in mind when you're dealing with genres, is that these are artificial constructs. These are things, people talk about social constructs. Genres actually are a social construct. They're not merely, they're not something that exists in the absence of people. There's no alien would come down and be like, we've discovered the mystery genre, right? They'd be like, why do these creatures group these books over here? Oh, well, I guess they have these things in common, but they made the things themselves. So you're directing things towards a category, but the things in the category were made to fulfill the things in the. You see what I mean? It's a little bit circular. Anyway, they're marketing terms. So, for instance, science fiction is a subgenre of fantasy. This upsets a lot of people. And this is because genres tend to be a little bit more important for the consumer, for the reader, than they are for the creator, for the writer. Is science fiction a subgenre of fantasy? Yeah. What is science fiction? Now think about Star Trek, right? Oh, well, we're traveling on a spaceship between bizarre worlds and meeting new life and new civilizations, and unexpected strange things happen that we have to figure out. We get into trouble. It's like the Odyssey in space, right? It's a fantastic journey. But there's aliens, not monsters, but the aliens are monsters, right? There's no orcs. There's aliens. Like you have Klingons instead of orcs, right? There's no magic in Star Trek. Beam me up, Scotty. Yeah, Star Trek is full of magic, but we call the magic technology, and then it's not something from the arcane, like given by the pagan gods or something. Instead, it is something that man created, but man hasn't actually created those things. We don't have a transporter, and we don't have a starship. These are magical devices. So yeah, science fiction is a subgenre of fantasy. But what does a science fiction reader expect out of a science fiction story now? Not 100 years ago, but now. Well, they expect, spaceships or aliens, technology that does things to people and by people. That's science fiction. What does someone expect in fantasy? They expect magic doing things to people, right? It's the same expectation, but we have a different explanation behind it. Science fiction takes place in the future, and fantasy takes place in another world or kind of in the past, right? Like medieval fantasy and things like that, which I've written. So when you're writing genre fantasy, this is always one of the problems with writing genre fantasy, is that readers have a really set, right? They have a firm set of expectations for what they're going to get out of the book. But at the same time, if you perfectly meet those expectations, it'll actually be a boring book. So the development of genre is all about innovation to a degree. It's same but different. So if you're writing genre fiction, what you really have to do is you have to pick a genre. It's like you're writing in a genre. You're going to make sure that you do some of the things that a reader can expect in that genre. And then you need to do a couple of things that the reader might not expect or might be a little bit different from the genre. Either it's a different construction for the world, or like there's a different source of the magic, or something like that in fantasy. You have science fiction, but you go back in time and capture knights or something, right? You add some element that's a little bit not part of the expectations and play around with that. And then that becomes like the genre innovation of whatever you're looking at as far as literature goes. If you look at science fiction 100 years ago, it's dominated by adventure fiction. And a couple of writers, including J.D. Cowan, who, I'm in a book with J.D. Cowan called Generation Y, The New Lost Generation. But he had a book, oh my gosh, the name's slipping me. I'll have to look it up. Basically about the genre wars and like how science fiction was taken over by fanatics, and then was changed from what it was. 100 years ago, science fiction was stuff like Edgar Rice Burroughs. It was like Princess of Mars. Even Tarzan was science fiction. H.P. Lovecraft was science fiction, but people wouldn't think of that. Now we're like, oh, that's horror. Well, it's like we didn't have a firm idea of what horror genre meant, meaning the expectations back then were different than the expectations are now for these genres. As time went on, people wanted to write in the science fiction genre what Brian Niemeyer's called big men with screwdrivers stories. It's like we have a problem, and the men with screwdrivers are going to fix it. We're going to fix it with technology and our reason. And that's kind of Star Trek, right? Star Trek is big men with screwdrivers. We're going to fix it with our special reason and our enlightenment. We're going to fix problems. And that became kind of an expectation for science fiction, so that if you go to a person now and you say, here's the science fiction of the 1930s, like the pulp science fiction, they'd be like, well, that's like science fantasy. They conjure up these new genres and call them things based on their current set of expectations for what they think should be in a genre fiction book. You see this with music too. So to make a parallel with music, you have something like Black Sabbath, right? Black Sabbath is metal. They're heavy metal. A lot of times they're viewed as the first heavy metal band, but there's often debate as to what qualifies in those early years. Is Led Zeppelin heavy metal? A lot of people said yes. Is Deep Purple heavy metal? Most people say yes, but you listen to it now, you're like, it doesn't really sound like any metal band I hear now. Not Deep Purple. Black Sabbath, yeah. Black Sabbath has the superior influence. But, most stuff I hear now doesn't sound like Deep Purple, like at least those first Deep Purple albums. Is the first Rainbow album metal? I mean, the second one, it sounds really similar. But the expectations weren't firm back then. But we still had this idea of like what heavy metal might be, like this little subgenre called heavy metal that kind of grew into its own thing. So you'd want to avoid the problems of modern science fiction people in thinking that science fiction is what I expect it to be in the current year based on what the major publishers are giving me in the current year, and it's not there's not a history to the genre that's different from what you expect. It'd be like saying jazz is Bela Fleck and the Flecktones. And then you hear Miles Davis, you hear like Birth of the Cool, and you're like, that's not jazz. It's like, yeah. Well, maybe what you're listening to now is so different, it actually shouldn't be called jazz. So genres are all about expectations. That's the big takeaway. And as expectations change, what you put into the genre changes. I know this because I write fantasy, and my fantasy books tend to be a little bit more old school. My bigger influences, most of my big influences are from before 1980. Like, I read modern stuff, and I like modern stuff. I like Brandon Sanderson, I like Steven Erikson, whatever. I like that stuff. I wouldn't say it influences me as a writer, though. It's not like what I think about when I'm writing. I think about much earlier stuff like Poul Anderson or J.R.R. Tolkien or Robert E. Howard or Michael Moorcock, stuff like that. So I don't really think of modern fantasy. So that means my books end up coming out because of that influence a little more old school. And people are like, this is weird, or this is not fantasy. Where's all the, why is it short? Things like that. So it's just different. I present it in a totally different fashion than a modern approach to prose even, right? So there's all kinds of things that go into modern expectations besides like, this genre includes that. Let me take a look at the chat real quick before I talk about the next thing, which is like micro genres and how you market through genres and how can be a problem as an artist. It's a classification system. All fiction is technically fantasy. Well, yeah, it's fiction. That doesn't mean it's fantasy. So fantasy is a subset of fiction, right? It's something that's fantastical that couldn't be real versus something that could be real, which is maybe speculative. What if it was like this? I do sometimes see fantasy and sci-fi grouped together. They ought to be. They're technically the same. They just have different settings. Sometimes genres are defined by settings. Teleport via scroll, magic. Teleport via metal box, technology. Science fiction versus fantasy. And if you look at older fantasy, they had old technology stuff there all the time, If you read something like Jack Vance's stuff had old, the ancient technology was there. Like they get in a helicopter in one of his stories and like fly out of this land where these two groups of religious people can't actually see each other because of some magic that's on them. So like magic and technology freely mixed with each other in a lot of this older stuff. It wasn't like a hard and fast, this is fantasy and this is science fiction kind of thing. That's a modern impression on it. Raul Nyanzi says, I think a lot of the cliches of a genre come from not wanting to explain things. Yeah, you could write elements like kings, princesses, and knights into a fantasy story with the expectation that the reader will get it without much explanation. Yeah. The Book of Frankenstein says nothing about how he made the monster or brought it to life. There you go. But is it science fiction? Probably didn't. I don't know. Right? Back then, that wasn't that genre fiction wasn't a thing back then. That's part of the corporate period too. So let me move on to like part 2, which is like genres as marketing devices are a product of the corporate period. We don't see a lot of genre fiction prior to about 1900. We see it in its infancy in the 1800s with things like mystery stories and magazines that would publish fiction. But really it's in the corporate period where things take off. Mass media begins to genreify literature and music and everything else into little categories that people can pick out and have a good set of expectations for what they're going to see prior to them reading it or looking at it. So the corporate period is important because that way with these classifications, we can move the books to where we think they'll be sold, and we can put them in places where the reader can find them and get what they want. So it's an increase in the efficiency of getting the stuff you want. You go to a bookstore, you go to the mystery section, you pick up a mystery book, you're going to get a mystery. You go to the bookstore, you go to the science fiction section, you pick up a science fiction book, you're going to get a science fiction story, right? Science fiction being fulfilling the expectations of science fiction readers. So if you already have read science fiction, then you have maybe a set of expectations for how like science fiction stories should be, and then that story is going to fulfill those expectations. If you've never read science fiction before, you don't have those, right? So it's really about selling books. So as we exit the corporate period, genres are actually more important than ever because we don't have a big place like a bookstore where things can be loosely mixed together. Rather, we have a lot more finer segmentation. So a genre is all about segmenting the market. Romance readers, science fiction readers, nonfiction readers, whatever, right? Like, it's about segmenting the market into interests that are focused on the consumer, not focused on the quality of the book at all. I think that's also why there's a lot of focus on classics written prior to the corporate period, like Dostoevsky. What genre is he? They're like, oh, it's literature. Literature is not a genre, guys. Literary fiction, there's no such thing as literary fiction, right? Dostoevsky wrote stories according to how he wanted to write them, and he wrote them in a time and place where there wasn't this fine market segmentation where people would put the book down because it didn't do what they wanted it to do. Okay, so, what is Charles Dickens? Well, it's 19th century popular fiction. What do you want me to tell you? Right, that's a great way of classifying it. Right, doom metal retroactively. That's Black Sabbath, right? Oh, I listen to doom metal, like Black Sabbath. It's like that wasn't called doom metal back when they wrote it, right? Like, when they came out with Dehumanizer, which is thought of as like this doom record. It's like, we weren't thinking like that. They were like, well, we're just coming out with another rock and roll record. Children of the Grave. Children of the Sea, I like better. J.D. Cowan's research is thorough, but I think a few of his conclusions aren't quite correct, such as his belief of how the term science fiction came to exist. Oh, I'm not going to debate all that, but, what became the expectation for science fiction? Very different today than it was 100 years ago, for sure. People started to say it was science fiction in modern times. I hesitated to say it because a woman wrote it. That's funny. I'm reminded of that episode of Futurama where the professor was giving a long-winded explanation of his new invention. And Fry just said, right, magic, got it. Ozzy's voice is the most unique in rock, along with the original Small Faces Marriott. Ozzy does have a unique voice. I don't love him as a vocalist, personally. I'd actually say he's my least favorite Black Sabbath vocalist. Not the least favorite music, but my least favorite of his actual vocal performance. I think he's the worst vocalist Black Sabbath had. That's my opinion of Ozzy Osbourne. Yeah. Anyway, so what do you need to do as a writer in the modern era? I shouldn't say modern, in the postmodern, postmodern, the 21st century era to think about genres. Well, genres have become more separated and more finely gradated. So one of the techniques that I've talked about, and you may have heard gurus talk about as far as writing fiction, is targeting a genre and writing for that. We call that writing to market. So there is a microgenre, and I always say vampire fiction because that's just a microgenre that I think of that's like has a really like solid set of expectations. It's like you're going to have vampire romance. It's going to be like Twilight. Like you just kind of know what it's going to be. But it could be anything. It could be military. Let's do military fantasy because I've written military fantasy, right? So, or military sci-fi. Could be any of these. What the heck is military? What is military sci-fi? When you think of a work that's like it, I think of like Starship Troopers. So Starship Troopers is probably the most like influential in the genre, which I don't know how Heinlein would feel about that because he didn't, all the things that they took out of Starship Troopers to make this genre are not things that Heinlein would have really emphasized himself. That's what I find so funny about like Starship Troopers. I find a lot of things funny about it. There's Oedipal stuff in Starship Troopers that I've talked about that's really silly. When you take a step back, you'd be like, I wonder what the author's saying about his father here. You know, where like Johnny Rico's father ends up as like his like lieutenant or something like that. It's really weird. It's weird stuff that I would never write. But then he wrote Stranger in a Strange Land, where he, basically had alien people not understanding human sexuality, as the human sexuality was like constructed externally and was a technology that we just decided that we were going to impose upon people. That was very big in the 20th century. But as a writer, you can target a microgenre. We'll do military science fiction. All right, we're going to have science fiction elements. There's going to be spaceships. And we're going to have military aspects. It's going to be all about soldiers in an army. And maybe we'll have an enemy that's aliens. So it's like we have the trappings of Starship Troopers without any of the substance behind it, like none of the themes. So you have soldiers fighting aliens. That's military science fiction. Okay. So what if I say I'm going to write a military science fiction book and there's no soldiers? Well, obviously it's not military science fiction. Get the hell out of here. Get out of this genre. So if you're going to write military science fiction, you have to have soldiers in it. It has to be about an army, some kind of starship army, right? And even then, there's more fine expectations like, this military sci-fi book was all about guys on a starship, and there was no one going down to the planets to shoot the aliens in the face. This shouldn't be in the genre. It's too naval, right? Star Trek's very naval. So is Star Trek is military science fiction, right? It fulfills... Oh, no, it's not, because is it? Oh my gosh. I just figured out Star Trek is military sci-fi. Sometimes Star Trek is military sci-fi, but it's not defining itself by the fact that they're in the military, that there's admirals, that they're engaging in naval battles, sometimes, shooting aliens in the face with phasers, right? They're doing that. But we have a different feel for military sci-fi. It's going to be like Starship Troopers. There's going to be like an infantry troop, right? It's going to duplicate 11 Bravo. It's 11 Bravo in space. And that's what military science fiction is. So you can leave your readers, if you're trying to write that, upset because you don't fulfill their expectations. But it's like, let's say we're going to have, it's 11 Bravo in space, but we're going to do something different. Okay. They transport to an alternate dimension where there's knights or something. And then but the knights have magic. So it's magic versus guns. Boom. There's a best-selling military sci-fi book right there for you. We just do one little twist on the genre. But you have to hit like the genre expectations really solidly. It has to feel like Starship Troopers. A bunch of, band of brothers, but in space with machine guns shooting aliens in the face. But this time the aliens are wizards, right? That's what you're going to do. So, military sci-fi readers want accurate setup towards military procedures, tactics, and lingo. I would actually say... So this is a funny thing to me. Is like, what makes you think that the military tactics and lingo in the 2500s are going to be the same as they are in the 2000s? Is the military anything now like it was in 1500? It's a little bit. Like, there's a hierarchical organization. But chances are, if you went back in time to like the shot and pike era, there weren't pikemen going, "Sir, yes, sir." They just obeyed orders. Like the military tradition that we think of as like these military lingos and this military, that's from the 19th century. Like, that's very modern. Anyway, I'm not trying to like poke holes in the military sci-fi thing, but it's about what a person wants from our time being brought into the science fiction area. So I think Fiona Wolf is like really onto something with military sci-fi. We want 11 Bravo in space. We want it to be like our military now, especially the United States military, but put into some science fiction setting. So it's a science fiction setting and conflict, but with our soldiers kind of transported. Think of like Aliens, right? Like the Marines from Aliens are a caricature of modern American soldiers. They're like a caricature, right? Everybody's like a hard farting, hard smoking, you know what I mean? And the real military is not really like that most of the time, but there's elements like that. It kind of points towards it, right? I say a caricature, that doesn't mean it doesn't resemble it at all. It just means that it's not totally realistic. So one of those funny things is like, military sci-fi guys want all this like realistic procedures and tactics. It's like all that flies out the window when you're putting it in a sci-fi story. The best military sci-fi I've read is stuff that I think most military sci-fi readers have read, but they're not thinking about the deeper stuff. Stuff like Forever War, which is much more about like the deeper themes versus the trappings. So this is a funny thing about genres, like modern microgenres, is the expectations are really focused on the style, the content, and not so much on themes, not so much on depth, things like that. It's more focused on like the technical way that it's executed for. It's kind of like if you want to define heavy metal, it's like, you have distorted guitars and fast drums, and maybe, you have some guitar solos. You have these things that make up metal. And then when you hear something that like does, something really emotional comes out of that, you're like, well, that's cool that they did something so deep with metal. But the classification of heavy metal has more to do with the technical construct rather than like the depth of what you're doing with it. So anyway, so if you're gonna write a military sci-fi book, yeah, you got to do like what Fiona Wolf says. It's got to be like 11 Bravo in space. And then you do something new or different with it. Like they fight wizards, they fight alien wizards with magic, and then they have to learn magic or something. You could do lots of cool things with it. But you have to get the reader's expectations about what they really want. When I wrote like military fantasy, it's much more based on 16th century tactics and warfare and military arrangements than it is on modern ones. So it's not, it's not going to be like a bunch of people acting like modern soldiers. That just wasn't part of the 16th century military existence. Most people were Tipperary volunteers or conscripts. They weren't these highly trained professional military people. That's more of a modern military tradition thing coming out of Europe in the 19th century. Anyway, Star Trek was originally pitched as Wagon Train to the Stars. Forbidden Planet was The Tempest, but in space. There you go. These are great pitches, actually. So, yeah, Star Trek is... I like to think of it as like the Odyssey in space. So it has very classical underpinnings, and that's why I think it functions so well. You never quite know what you're going to expect week to week, at least with the classic arrangement, which is going to be the original series and Star Trek The Next Generation, where every week is a new story, a new conflict, new ideas, new things that you get to tackle. Really fun that way. And there's a lot of great writers that wrote for those shows, like Harlan Ellison, who wrote classic Star Trek episodes like, I think, The City on the Edge of Forever he wrote. So he wrote a lot of classic stuff that, now we don't really think of like episode writers as being classic sci-fi, as like important sci-fi writers. But back then they just did whatever they were pros. They could just write Star Trek episodes. They were great at it. Yeah, Fiona Wolf's correct. I don't mind made up stuff, but I've seen some readers that expect it to be our world military, but transported. There you go. So there's your genre expectations. So when you're writing in a genre, you want to hit those expectations. One of the ways that people have told writers to write as far as genre is to find a microgenre where there's not enough books being written in it, but there's lots of readers. So maybe it's military sci-fi, maybe it's vampire romance, maybe it's like lesbian fantasy or something like that. So you find that microgenre and you write a bunch of books in it that people will buy because there's not enough books written in it. There's nothing wrong with that. If you want to write to market and make sure that you fulfill those expectations and you're writing books exactly like, not exactly, but very similar to the other books that they've written before, that's fine. I don't really write to market because I prefer to do things according to my whims and my artistic desires, knowing that like the money that I would make writing microgenre fiction would not be good enough for me to justify the amount of soul work that I'd have to do to make the book exist. So I don't really write to market, except in a very broad way. Like my books are fantasy. They're in the fantasy genre broadly. And I don't worry about adhering to this subgenre of fantasy or that subgenre. There's a bunch of subgenres of fantasy I'm just not interested in reading. It's like, this subgenre of fantasy is elves. I'm like, well, there's elves, so I guess my book might fit in that. But really, I don't like to think of it like that because that just limits you as a writer. And it means also that you're probably not going to take a lot of chances as a writer. It means that you're going to be, you're basically, look at my finger. It's like in perfect focus. There I am. It means that you're going to be writing like an AI. You might as well have an AI write a book if you're not going to do anything outside the genre at all. And in fact, you probably won't have a lot of success if you're just writing an extremely generic book. People say generic, they mean like it's overly standardized. And there's a derogatory word to generic, but there's also a good part to generic, right? That means it fits the genre and it meets the expectations of the readers. So when I make a fantasy cover, yes, I want to make a fantasy cover that looks like the book belongs in the fantasy section, that it's a fantasy book. I don't want to make a fantasy cover that doesn't look like a fantasy cover because people will not click on it and buy it. Your cover needs to be generic. That is, it needs to point to the genre. Does it need to be uninteresting, but it needs to fulfill the expectations of the genre or people will not click on it. Because what do they want? They want genre fiction. So if you're writing in the genre, you need to be able to, on some level, fulfill the genre expectations that are there. You know? Real military folk. Oh my God, look at all the paperwork. Trees of paperwork. Yeah. Yeah, no one wants to read that. It's like, oh yeah, what's this? This is a military sci-fi book. What are they doing? Well, they're sitting on base, half-assing their way through a bunch of paperwork, waiting for their next set of orders and where they're going to move in 6 months. It's like, and then fixing the cars in the motor pool. Like what? It's like, yeah, that's military life, dude. Like it's not drop zone into alien blast their face off land, right? Most of it is, it's technical work. It's like support work. It's managing supply chains, and there's a lot of stuff that goes into a modern military. The modern war machine is very complex. Even Roman soldiers weren't fighting battles all the time. They were building roads. I know we moved from the ad conversation, but another problem I have with ads, with sometimes there's like 5-minute ads for a 1-minute video. There's even 30-minute ads I've run into. Yeah, you can skip them. YouTube will always let you skip ads. I think some ads, they will require you to watch for like a full minute or even 2 minutes, but they never make you watch 30-minute ad. You can always skip away. But you pay extra for that time. So like if you make an ad, you're going to pay more to make it unskippable for a certain number of seconds. That gives you undivided attention of the viewer, and you can hook them with what you're selling. It works really well, believe it or not. So if you do a good ad that's like, do you want to make $1,000 to $5,000 per week doing from your living room? It's like, yeah, I do. Let me show you how you do it. It's like it keeps you watching past the point where like you would normally just click away from the ad. This year's been what to buy dad next, especially when it comes to books. Yeah. Galaxy's Edge does showcase how you can balance certain expectations versus the wild cards that go into the story and plot. Yeah. So Nick Cole's books, they definitely do that well. So you start with the expectations and you add some things to it that are a little bit unexpected. That's the key to writing genre fiction. It's same but different. And if you're going to work too far out of the genre, I guess, I don't know what to call it, paradigm, it becomes harder to sell your books because you don't know how to exactly tell people what's in the book. There's all these little signals that go into telling people what's in a book. Like I'll bring over my book roll real quick. So yeah, here's one of my books, Water of Awakening. Oh, I see magic. I see, this is an album that, anyway, I clicked away too fast. Oh, here we go. Science fiction. Look, we see science fiction font. We see like some pixelation. We see some weird things. It looks like sci-fi horror. That's basically what it is. So you get things like that. You want the cover to communicate what it is. When I wrote something like Afterglow, which it's well outside of genre fiction, it just doesn't fit. That's a little bit harder to market. It's really literary fiction because it just doesn't fit in the genres. There's no definitive like box that's literary fiction. It's just like, well, it's not really made to satisfy science fiction fans, And then you had authors, and I talked about this on stream last night, like Terry Goodkind, where he doesn't like being in the genre because it feels like it's too limiting. He just kind of chose the trappings of the genre to tell the story. He really cared about the themes, and there's nothing wrong with that. But I have to think that a lot of people who read his books care more about the genre expectations than the themes of them. Even though the people who really love his books the best care most about the themes. I think, the genre expectations are part of that. Some of my ideas involve both super science and the supernatural, sometimes coming into contact with each other. How tough a sell is that for readers? Just say it's Doom. It's like Doom, but this. That's Doom. That's the video game Doom. You can totally sell something with Doom, right? I haven't. I did for Voices of the Void, it's Aliens meets Lovecraft. But I could have said like Doom, but Lovecraft. Doom the book. I could have done something like that, but really it was more like emphasizing the creepiness of it, not like blasting aliens in the face. But yeah, you could totally emphasize stuff like that. Works great. So what do you point to that has like magic? It's like Jack Vance in space. You could say things like that. Now most people aren't reading Jack Vance these days, which is a real pity, but it's there. And then you do have stuff like Michael Moorcock uses science fiction elements in his fantasy, but he just it's just marketed as fantasy. You don't worry about the fact that someone's going, there's technology. Like, fantasy fans are way less objecting to other elements in their genre than science fiction fans. Science fiction fans are like, I don't know how to put it. I don't want to like insult science fiction fans too much, but the fandom is it's kind of like metal fans. It's very about itself and what makes this genre special in their eyes. So if you're inserting magic into science fiction, they get all pissy about it because they want only, atheistic technology stories in their science fiction. They're hard sci-fi, technical manuals, right? Whereas fantasy stuff, if you put a spaceship in a fantasy book, like, fantasy readers just think it's cool. That's all. They don't care about the spaceship doesn't bug them. Aliens don't bug them. Like, anything goes really with fantasy. You can throw anything into the bucket to shake up the genre or the micro genre you're working with. Science fiction, you're going to have readers that will say, this isn't even science fiction. So what? It's like people going, this isn't even metal. This Opeth album had no distortion on it. This isn't even metal. It's like, so? Is it good music? Oh, I love it. Okay. There you go. Oh, man, there's no solos on this album. It's not even metal. Do you like it? Oh, I love it. Okay. Maybe you didn't need guitar solos. Got the Audible for Jack Vance's Planet of Adventure. Still need to get to book 2. Cool. Dying Earth is a really good series. I like Dying Earth. Dying Earth is cool because, contrary to, it's very different from modern fantasy. Like a lot of fantasy from the mid-20th, it is a book that's assembled out of stories that were published in magazines and things like that. So if you read Dying Earth, it's a series of short stories. And so what's great is, like, you get story. And if you don't like one of them, it's okay. The next story's coming right back up, and you're probably going to like that. All in the same area, exploring the same world and the same setups and themes. And in some cases, like, some repeat characters. But it's really a cool approach. Michael Moorcock, some of his books are like this as well. They're really an assemblage of short stories. I think the Michael Moorcock kind of sticking together of short stories doesn't work out as good as Jack Vance at all, but I don't know, you be the judge of that. You should probably read both. Thank you, Raul Neonzi, for the super chat. In my sci-fi, there's a witch in the first story. I love it. That's good, right? I think it's really good to mix those things up. I like mixing those things. The question is, how would you sell it? Obviously, you're not going to sell it to hard sci-fi bros. You have to, like, space. It's not space opera. You're really going to sell it as fantasy, probably. Because, like, there's no big sci-fi genre that just includes magic as, like, part of its genre expectations. So you'd probably sell it as fantasy, and then science fiction is, like, the secondary genre, I guess. And this is why it's space fantasy. It's science fantasy. There's no such thing as that. Like, Star Wars is just science fiction, guys. But the Force is magic. Star Trek has shapeshifters and mind-reading Vulcans, and you still think it's science fiction. So, yeah. Star Wars is science fiction, guys. It's just science fiction. You don't need to chop it up because it's not about big men with screwdrivers, it is about androids, actually, but that's kind of in the background because it's not about, like, do androids dream of electric sheep? No, but androids do go, oh, Master Luke. Androids do that, apparently. Could Q be a type of witch? He could pretty much do anything. I view him as a god. It's like Deus Ex Machina. It's like a god coming down and being like, now I will... My camera goes out of focus. I need to turn that off. There it goes. The Rockstar can might be messing it up. Anyway. Yeah, Q's like a god. He fulfilled the same role as a god in an opera. Comes in, kind of shakes things up, messes things up, and sees how the hero reacts. He's like the devil in an opera. Very good character. I really like him a lot. I also like Eyes of the Overworld. Cudgel the Cleaver is a fun character. Yeah. The people who reviewed it thought the book was fun, so I guess they liked it. However, I wish I did more with that particular witch. You can always write a sequel, baby. GL says that Q is technically a demigod. He's a half god. I'm talking about like his. I don't remember like his birth. Like he was kicked out of the Q, which was like a collective of godlike beings. I just mean he functions as a god. To the people of the Enterprise, he's essentially all powerful. He is fickle, like the classical gods of yore, like the Greek gods. He exists to shake up the characters and provide some unpredictability. And if you anger him, you're going to end up in a bad place. Not really. Like, Q is very forgiving when you think about it. Like, Jean-Luc Picard doesn't treat Q with quite the amount of respect you ought to treat a godlike being. And Q's a trickster god, right? He's a Loki. And he's just kind of cool with it. He's like, aha, now I'll teach you a lesson, Picard. How dare you not give me the respect a god deserves. So yeah, he's just Loki in space. And I like that. You know, I like him being Loki in space. Doesn't need a starship after all. I need your starship. He gets kicked out of the queue. I'm trying to remember some of those cool. I haven't watched TNG in years, so I don't remember all the stories. But yeah. So anyway, that's the main thing that people really need to take away from genre, and why I want to talk about it is that genres don't exist. They're artificial. They're ways for us to properly fulfill the expectations of a reader. Those expectations change over time based on what goes into the genre. So it's a circular cycle. You write something in the genre that alters future expectations by a little bit, and before you know it, the genre has evolved into something that's different and has a different set of expectations. So when you think of fantasy, most people think of like, it's like magic and wizards and knights, and that's fantasy, right? And maybe a different world, new cool maps. There's all these little expectations, and I fulfill them all. Expectations I have found, and now fulfilled them all. I have maps in my books. I have all kinds of things like that I love from the genre. I do different things, though, and I have deeper themes, which I talk about, that most people don't really interact with in my books, and that's okay, as long as they have a story which they enjoy. That's okay too. Like, a lot of people don't really think about what the ring means in Lord of the Rings. They just kind of enjoy the story and the characters, and that's fine too. It's okay to not like aggressively understand every single deep theme of a work. You know, that's fine as far as I'm concerned. I do find it funny when Q poked at Janeway. Yeah. So here's the thing. Well, he has near unlimited powers, but Q seems to have limitations and perhaps a creator. So the idea of an omnipotent God is a Christian thing. That comes from the one true God, creator of all things, all powerful, all knowing, all loving, all understanding, right? An ultimate God that can do anything. The ultimate power is Yahweh, is the Christian God. That's not the way that pagans viewed gods at all. Gods were not all powerful at all. Now, in the Greek view, gods couldn't die, but they weren't all powerful. They couldn't do anything. They didn't know everything. You could deceive gods. Gods had limitations on their power. Gods had realms of power and influence, and outside of those, they didn't have influence. Zeus could not cause the sea to do something. Only Poseidon could do that because that was his realm of control. Zeus could cast a lightning bolt at you, right? But he couldn't make a storm just show up, or make a whirlpool show up and suck your ship down to the bottom of the ocean. That'd be Poseidon, right? So like different gods have different realms, different roles, and limited power. And that's the way most deities in most cultures work. Monotheistic approaches to religion view God as an omnipotent being, a being that has power over everything. His domain is infinite and goes to every corner of creation. That's not the way most gods are in most cultures. And I'm not trying to like dump on you, but I think Q fits like more like a Greek than like some function of our modern idea of what a god is. It's more like a Greek or Norse god. You know, he's like a dude. He has powers. He's pretty powerful, but he's not infinitely powerful. You know, he's almost omnipotent compared to the mortals he deals with, but he's not like an infinite god, you know. If you want to know more about how gods were seen by the ancients, I'd recommend The Ancient City. Fascinating read. There's lots of other stuff. I need to like come up with like a little reading list on like ancient paganism and stuff. Most people's idea of paganism is so completely out of sync with what ancient people practiced religiously. It's difficult to bridge that gap and be like, well, like the myths that we tell and we deal with about Zeus, for instance, that's not the Greek religion. Most religions don't have a Bible, like a sacred document that supposed to contain all the elements of that religion. They may have stories associated with it, but you notice as you dig into, say, Greek and Roman mythology, that these stories aren't consistent with each other and often contradictory. Well, what did the ancient people actually believe? Well, their emphasis wasn't on the stories. Their emphasis was on the ritual. The religion was the ritual. It wasn't like, it wasn't the stories. It wasn't the fact that Zeus turned himself into a cow or whatever he did, or had this son with this human. That's not part of the religion. That's a set of the background of the culture. That's sort of the background of the god that you are then performing sacrifices for to gain the favor of. Paganism was very transactional. I perform a sacrifice, I burn the fat, the god smells it, and this is even in the Bible. It's like a pleasing smell goes up to heaven. So there's elements of this that, of course, find their, that are in Christianity and Judaism and Islam, but not in the way that they are with pagan religions, where it's this transactional thing. You do all these rituals and then you go perform some auspice, you go bird watching, and the birds will give you an omen according to what the gods will do. Paganism was about the ritual, not about like stories about the gods. But, in the post-Christian world, what tends to be presented in schools is like, we're going to learn about Greek mythology. And I hear that, I'm like, oh boy, tell me what you were miseducated on, because it's going to be fascinating. I learned this and this about Zeus. I'm like, well, let me tell you. How were the heaven and earth created in the Greek mythology? They weren't created. They just sprang into existence. They sprang out of chaos. And some cosmologies, heaven and earth are not the first beings. There's Nyx, there's night. In some things, it's Eros, it's love, or Aphrodite is the first god is Aphrodite, even though these tales are like, wait, Aphrodite, wasn't she born from Kronos' dick or something, right? Like, so there's all these different mythologies that explain the origin of the gods, and they're often contradictory, but that's not where the emphasis was. The reason Aphrodite would be the first god or goddess is because all of creation in the Greek cosmological view is created through sex. So the heavens and the earth, right? Was it Kronos? No. Who am I thinking of? Is it Kronos? No, he was a Titan. Not Kronos. Anyway, you have heaven, the firmament, and you have earth, Gaia, and the heavens have sex with the earth to produce the Titans. But the Titans can't escape from Earth's womb because the heaven is literally the sky is pressed upon Earth. And Kronos has to cut the dick off of heaven, and then he withdraws, and then there's space for life to exist between the heavens and the earth. That's weird, right? You probably didn't have that explained to you in school, but that's like the essence of it, is that all life began through sexual intercourse, and you had to castrate the father to have him, and you threw it into the sea, and then Aphrodite washed up on the shores in the foam, right? Kronos was the Titan, and he cut who was his father? Predecessor, Uranus, the heavens. And cut the dick off, right? And you have this cycle repeat. Like, one gods are overthrown by others. There's mythology involving like the golden age man descending into the Iron Age man. All that stuff is part of mythology that explains things, but the emphasis is really on the ritual. Like, why does that stuff matter? It only matters because it explains how the world works, and less like in a broad sense how your ritual is going to be directed towards the gods, A major pagan difference, the gods were also imprisoned to emotion, jealousy. Yeah, they were. If you read something like the Odyssey or the Iliad, you see that the gods are jealous of each other. In some cases, they're quite immature and childlike. Being immortal and free from consequences, they also lack the maturity to have any kind of self-sacrifice or self-denial for the benefit of another. Like the conflict of the Iliad begins between some goddesses who are trying to decide who's the most beautiful. You know, they're arguing over their own vanity. One city could worship Theseus, the other could also worship Theseus. The ancients saw them as separate gods. Yes. So this is another thing too, very subtle, is like there's Jupiter, the Jupiter that you went to the temple to see and offer incense to, perform part of your state sacrifices, may not be the same Jupiter that you had in your hallway. Might not be the same Jupiter. Or it may be the same Jupiter, but different aspects, different manifestations of the same Jupiter, and therefore different. Jupiter Optimus Maximus was the Jupiter in the temple. Your Jupiter might be your family's Jupiter, your family's Zeus. And you actually get elements of this in the Bible if you look carefully, where all of the household gods are stolen and stuck in a saddle in one of the stories. And, it's like, why do they think stealing the idol is like stealing the god? It's like they viewed these things as separate gods, and that idol is like a portal to the real God that's beyond just that physical object. So the god is the physical object and is not the physical object. Pagans had this subtlety of mind where they could consider conflicting things to both be true. Because what the emphasis was on the ritual and what it did, and like trying to wrap your mind around or to find a god was not as important as it is today. It was pre-theological. Like the theology wasn't a thing back then. Yeah. Most stories came from priestess who took drugs, got high out of their minds. Honestly, sounds fun to live in a society based off junkie acid. I don't know about that, but we do know that they're passed down orally. And so one of the things that happens with oral transmission is there's alterations of details. And it's hard to figure out what the meaning of these are because the details often get confusing. And one group of people, as they pass down the tale, adds certain details or emphasizes details that were there originally, and one lets those details rot away and forgets about them. So you end up with different, like sometimes really strongly different variations of the same tale, depending on where you're getting it from, which is interesting. And a lot of our information on like mythology comes from, for example, Ovid, who wrote the Metamorphoses, which has some somewhat humorous or satirical elements to it. So it's relying on the audience already being familiar with everything that's in it. So we, outside of that, who are not familiar with everything that's in it from our oral traditions, it can be a somewhat confusing document to try to figure out just what people believed as far as their mythological or cosmological understanding back then. We don't want to like make assumptions or take things for granted. Rather, we have to look at that as like a portal, a fuzzy portal into what people believed in the past. Many people might have conflicting ideas about, or just different stories about the gods, and when we collect them all together, we have this compendium of stories about Zeus or something, but some of those stories would be completely unfamiliar to a person at the time. If you go back to 1st century BC Athens and you said, here's a story about Zeus, they'd be like, I've never heard that before. Where did you get that? Is that a story that they tell in Thebes or something? And you're like, oh, maybe it is. I don't know. Yeah. There were female Greek gods, the goddesses. There were male Greek gods, the gods. There are interesting theories that many of the Greek and Norse myths are based on biblical events but changed through generations of retelling. Hercules equals Samson, Pandora equals Eve, for instance. Yeah, I can't get too deep into that because we're getting into evidence. Like, where's the evidence for that? But we certainly see echoes, cultural transmission of ideas. Samson is a very, very old idea indeed, a very, very old character in the Bible, a very old person. And so as tales of Samson spread, especially since they're written down, Hebrews wrote a lot of stuff down. Maybe later, but they wrote it down eventually. But as it spreads, it's going to have cultural influence outside of its original sphere. Like the Hebrews did not live in isolation. They lived next to Phoenicians and all these other different peoples that you read about in the Bible, and some are not in the Bible, or some of them you only encounter later in like the Maccabees. So they're going to transmit their beliefs and their tales to other cultures and how those get transmuted. What a really interesting one is, if you're looking at Odin, for instance, Odin sacrifices himself upon a tree, a sacrifice of himself to himself by hanging upon a tree. Now, I think he hangs for 9 days, not 3, but he's pierced with a spear upon a tree. And then he descends into, his spirit like basically descends into the underworld, where he learns the secrets of life and death and things like that. So this story of Odin hanging on a tree, being sacrificed to himself, is this like a transmutation of Christ's story? It's an interesting question. We don't know. It could just be that two cultures came up with two similar ideas, and it could be one culture influenced another, and those things got picked up in the telling along the way, because Christianity had been transmitted all over Europe for far longer than a lot of people realized. Just because the Vikings or the Scandinavians were still pagan in the 11th century doesn't mean that they had no idea what, had never encountered Christians before they started raiding monasteries. Rather, those ideas may have been transmitted culturally for hundreds of years at that point. So we don't really know where the origins are by the time, for instance, Snorri Sturluson writes down some of those tales. We just don't know how long they were told in a certain way, or how they were originally told. We don't know that stuff. So for me, they're fun theories, they're fun ideas to think about. We can assume some cultural, kind of cross-pollination, but you don't want to assume that one culture is just lifting a myth from another wholesale, because otherwise you end up in some really weird syncretist beliefs that are just they're basically woo-woo as far as I'm concerned. And one of them is like this belief that somehow the Virgin Mary is like a transmutation of Isis, because they were both female and gave birth. It's like that's what females do, they give birth. Like, you don't see this idea of the Virgin Mary being a transmutation of Hera or something like that, or of another virgin goddess, like who am I thinking of? Am I thinking of Athena? Right. So just because a god or god, just because a goddess was a virgin, or just because a goddess gave birth, doesn't mean that like Christians just took that and turned it into Mary. This is a more of a modern and Protestant belief that the large and very ancient Christian tradition was somehow assembled out of pagan traditions, because modern Protestants want to reject those traditions. It's really a bunch of nonsense when you go and you look deep into it, that there's very little similar, and you certainly wouldn't say that about every myth, that somehow it got pulled from another culture. Well, where did they all start? It's like, well, did they all start in Egypt? Did they all start in Mesopotamia? No, cultures transmit their own stories. Sometimes they pick up things from other cultures. Sometimes through syncretism, Roman syncretism, Romans would bring mythologies into their own religious spheres and bring gods into their own pantheon, because they saw a practical benefit to the state. Let's bring the god here, we'll honor that god, and that god will like our city and will give us prosperity. It was a transactional thing, not a theological thing. I think that's a lot of modern stuff being pasted on this. And even now, if you go look up Egyptian gods, they'll start trying to pretend that like Christianity is some derivative of the Egyptian. It's like, well, there were Christians in Egypt. There were Christians in Rome. Does it mean that Christianity is a derivative of the Roman pagan state? Right? There were Christians in every corner of Europe. That doesn't mean why was Christianity so much the same to itself everywhere? If it was there are regional emphases. It's like, well, if I go to Ethiopia, the icons have black skin. It's like, yeah, because that's what Ethiopians look like. That doesn't mean that they like the icons actually kind of look like Greek icons and they look like Latin icons. They're still icons. The church is arranged the same, right? Now, Ethiopians are non-Chalcedonian, so they don't believe in like the two natures of Christ, but they have really extremely similar theological beliefs, right? Anyway, I saw a video a while ago which noted how many ancient religions shared common iconography: the underground lake, river, and a tree. Yeah, so those might be pointing to some truth, too. Is that people, when they're closer to the origin of God, don't need mythology to explain things. They understood the cosmology directly. That's I think Tolkien expressed this before, like why there's not a bunch of worship in Lord of the Rings is because they're closer to the gods at that point. The gods are still like acting in the world. Do you have any advice on writing mystery religions for fantasy? Yeah. So let's mystery religions like the Dionysian cults. So any cult is arranged between an in-group and an out-group, and any cult is arranged hierarchically where in order to gain the mysteries of the cult, you have to move through various stages of membership, whether you're looking at ancient Gnostics or you're looking at a cult of Dionysus, or you're looking at any of the other ancient mystery cults, many of which we don't know all the mysteries for because the mysteries were lost when people abandoned those cults. So they died with the last people who practiced the cult. So we don't know a lot of the mysteries of the mystery cults. So you want to have that structure. Now, why would you hide certain things higher up? Is because the certain things higher up, the mysteries that are higher up, are going to reveal to the practitioner something special. So what's the special thing? It's going to be a cosmologically special thing, and then a special thing that's for the benefit of the cult, of the cultist. So the benefit of the cultist might be the path to eternal life. Might be part of a mystery cult. So they study with the gurus. They pass through the various phases. Like a Masonic, the Masons, if you just take the Masons and make it a little bit more religious, you have a cult. The Masons are arranged as a cult. It's one of the reasons why, for instance, Catholics are forbidden from being Masons. And, even when I was a Mennonite, which I was raised as a Mennonite, you were not to join Masons or any other secret society for that reason. They were viewed as cults, as well as, you shouldn't have secret societies because they are cults, but also because your yes needs to be yes and your no means no. And you're in a secret society, you can't truly be honest with people by keeping secrets from them, especially important secrets. So yeah, if you arrange it like the Masons, you have a basic mystery religion. The Masons are, their arrangement of their organization is like a mystery religion. In your book, you would want to think of like, what's the big reveal that the mystery religion has? What's the big reveal? Like they have something that reveals it's like, haha, Jupiter is really the son of a bigger god, and all the gods are imprisoned in the sphere trying to get out. This is kind of like a Gnostic thing I'm making up here. And so we have the way to actually get out past the gods, but you have to perform this right. And we don't just give it to anyone because we'll anger the archons if we allow unworthy spirits out of the dome encircling the false gods of Zeus, whatever you want to do. So that would be like the big reveal. And then the second part of that, what's the benefit to the cultist, would be salvation of some kind, right? Like permanent life. There's like little mystery cults in Elder Scrolls. So if you've played Elder Scrolls, there's little mystery cults. All the Daedric cults are little mystery cults. You work your way up through the ranks. You gain the favor of the Daedra, and then the Daedra grants you something either in this life, or he grants you, like for instance with Hircine, you get to live eternally in the hunt. As like a wild beast, hunting forever, like if that's what you want, because that's his realm of oblivion. So you basically get eternal life within this certain constraint versus an unknown kind of salvation. So anyway, that's why mystery cults worked. There are some small elements of mystery cult stuff even in Christianity, but Christianity is so esoteric, it's difficult in the post-Christian world to think of mystery cults because they're such an unfamiliar thing to us. We're so used to religions just telling you everything. Like Islam is exoteric for the most part. There are esoteric elements of Judaism, but it's mostly exoteric. Like you can go to a rabbi and he'll just answer every question that you might want to know, and you can just read the Talmud if you want to. And you can read the Bible. The Bible is published. You can go ask a priest, and he's not going to be like, since you're not part of our religion, I can't really tell you that. But there's small parts of it left over in certain versions of the liturgy. So if you are attending a liturgy of an Eastern liturgy, either Eastern Catholic or Eastern Orthodox, you may see the liturgy of, there's St. James liturgy, which you're only going to see a couple times a year. But, oh my gosh, who's the common one? For some reason, I just spaced on the most common liturgy that you're going to see in the Eastern Orthodox Church. I've seen it a bunch of times in Eastern churches, either Eastern Catholic or Orthodox. St. John Chrysostom's liturgy. There's a part where it's like the doors. You hear that in the liturgy. What the hell is the doors? Why are we talking about the doors? Why does the doors matter? Well, you have to think back to the ancient Christians. The doors was make sure there's nobody who's not one of us here, because now we're going to do communion. And communion is a bit of a mystery. We could still call them mysteries, right? So it's that element of a mystery part of the religion, which is an unexplained, but we don't explain the mysteries. Mysteries have a different emphasis in Christianity, but you have this element of you can think of that, make sure there's no outsiders here, because we're going to do something that is really for us and won't make sense to them and could get us killed for doing it, which is where we're going to turn the bread and wine into the body and blood of Jesus Christ, and we're going to eat his flesh and drink his blood. That's what communion is, right? And there's, after Christianity, this is really post-Christian, you have Dionysian cults that have ideas where we're going to transform a deer into Dionysus and then eat him, and we'll be eating Dionysus. It's actually probably derived from Christianity. I don't have evidence for that, but we don't know about those mysteries until after Christianity. So where they got them, I don't know. But anyway, yeah. So you have a small element of the mystery cult there still present in the very ancient liturgies of Christianity, which was a persecuted religion to a certain extent, and depending on the time, and one where there were rites that were reserved just for those who were members. And one of those was communion. You can't take communion unless you're a member of the church. And certain Orthodox churches will still kick people out at communion. If you're not a member of the church, you got to leave. You can't actually be present for the communion ceremony. It just depends on the church and the attitudes of the priest that is performing the liturgy there. But for most Catholic churches and Eastern Catholic churches, you're going to be able to see that mystery. We're going to be able to witness it because it's no longer a thing where we have to make sure that there's no Roman spies here that will send us to go get eaten by lions. Right? Anyway. So if you have those things, you're probably going to nail a mystery religion. Finally caught him live. Thank you. Unfortunately, more evidence is required for such an argument. What was it? It could be argued that all the world's religions and beliefs emanate from a singular history. This is kind of a, you can, I wouldn't say argue. I think it's a powerful idea, and it's one that is supported by scripture, which is, that there is one true religion, and other ones is people have adopted other beliefs in false gods and have fallen. It's the human part of the human nature falling away from God. It's to fall away from his true nature as well and worship things that ought not to be worshipped, either to conjure up gods or to worship demons. And a lot of the saints, including the Desert Fathers, just out and out said it, that the oracles and the gods, the Greek gods, are demons, and that any kind of oracular magic that you're experiencing is a demon exploiting you, because demons are not bound by time and space. If they can warn you about a storm, it's because they can move instantly to where a storm is and know that it's coming, or something like that, right? So because they're not bound by time and space the way you are, it can seem like they're predicting the future, but they're not really doing that. I want to say that is, who explained that? I think it's from Life of St. Anthony by St. Athanasius. YouTube won't let me post links or email addresses, so let's try something. So yes, I can't see them and approve them even in chat. It just cuts them out. So sorry. We don't want to argue that this is the way it is, but it could be, because there's so many similarities. Very commonly, there's a flood myth in so many different cultures. There's a myth of flood of some kind. So does that refer to an actual historical event? In a sort of hard science way, we just don't have enough evidence to say that, but it makes a lot of sense that there was some commonality, there was some common event that everyone remembered, and then through the mists of time, it got obscured, and myth became, stories became, truth became legend, became myth. And so we have an obscured view of ancient divine events in different religions, or like what actually happened. So yeah, that's a really common idea. There's also an idea that, like, when we look at Indo-European languages, that languages descended from a common ancestor the way that genes did, right? The people descended from a common set of people, an Adam and Eve. And so did language, that as people got separated, their language got separated from each other and they can no longer understand each other. So Indo-European languages versus these other language groups. Linguists kind of studied this stuff to see how our languages descended, how they were constructed, things like that. And a lot of philologists in the 20th century had a belief that this pointed to, if you were to go far enough back, that there would be some sort of common language that everyone understood. Anyway, that's my advice on writing mystery religions. Hopefully that'll be helpful. A lot of stuff to talk about. Anyway, I'm starting to run out of time here today talking about genres. So let me reiterate the big lessons about genre. Genre is a marketing tool. It's created to market, to give people products that are going to fulfill their expectations. Genres are somewhat self-referential. They are recursive. They feed back into themselves. So the expectations for a genre have to do with what has already been in the genre, then altering those expectations in the future. So when you target a genre, you want to know what expectations a reader actually has for that genre, and then you want to create some new ones on top of that. You want to do some things that the reader is not going to expect. And that is what's going to make your work stand out. You need to take some risks. You need to take some chances with what you're doing. Don't just stick hard to the genre and write it exactly the way that another writer wrote it, or it'll be boring and people honestly won't be interested in it, except like, I guess I wanted more of this and that gave me that for that Tuesday that I read it. And then they have nothing really else to say about it. So yeah, you got to take some risks. You got to do some stuff outside the genre. Remember that genres, there's nothing that defines them in a metaphysical sense. They're categories we created to put books in places where people could find books that they wanted to read based on their pre-existing desires for what they wanted to see in a book. That's what genres are. I tend to always, if I'm writing a genre, it's loosely in the genre, and then there's always try to have something that's a little bit different in there. And that's the way I do it, How are new genres created? That's a great question. It's something that's already in one genre, but it's so different that it creates a new genre, like Black Sabbath creating heavy metal out of rock and roll and blues. They were really like a blues band or a rock and roll band, rock band, and then they did something and they really took what they were doing in one specific direction. Other people copied that, then you get the genre. So the genre doesn't exist till other people are copying the new thing that happens. So if we're looking at military science fiction is not a genre until other people are doing the same things as other people. Death metal is not a genre until other people are trying to make music that sounds like another death metal band, right? It necessarily cordons itself off and tries to make itself sound like other things, right? Power metal sounds like power metal because it wants to sound like other power metal bands. The first power metal bands like Halloween, right? Were they like, we're power metal? No, they were just playing metal. They probably called themselves thrash metal. The first Halloween album is very thrash. Same thing with Blind Guardian. And then later people called it power metal. They're like, oh, Manowar and Blind Guardian and Halloween, these are power metal bands. It's like, okay. Then newer power metal bands try to sound like Halloween and Manowar, and it kind of shrinks the genre and defines it and focuses it to the point where people listen to the first Halloween record and they're like, that's not power metal. It's like, that invented power metal though, right? So anyway, that's how genres begin, is that somebody does something really original and then it becomes a thing. People start to copy it, and after enough people copy it, then it becomes a genre. So original, copies. As the copies happen, the focus gets tighter, and that's how you get a genre created. Right. Now that's still a marketing thing, because it's at a certain point the marketer has to recognize, well, this is a genre, and the artists have to define what they're doing as a genre. I write military science fiction. It's an attempt to set up the expectations for the reader. This is what my book's going to have in it. Even if Starship Troopers, like Heinlein did not say, I'm writing military science fiction. He's like, I'm just writing a science fiction book. But as people copy elements from it, and they're like, I'm doing something like this other thing. It's always the comparison. This is like that. This is like that. Then you end up with a genre. So, Cannibal Corpse is like, we play death metal. What is death metal? It's metal that sounds like death and possessed. That's death metal. So as we kind of copy the style from Death and Possessed, you end up with death metal, right? All right. By the way, I played Cyberpunk Phantom Liberty, and I strongly suggest it. Roughly only 20 hours, and it's a much better story than the base game. I will give it a try. Thank you, Zimumaru, because I enjoyed the base Cyberpunk game. When I was done with it. But if there's another good campaign, then yeah, maybe I'll check it out. Yeah, YouTube will not physically let Brian post his email address. Yeah, it won't work. Try his website, brianniemeyer.com. Did you know that some genre names are trademarked? I did not know that. That is interesting. Alternative Comics founder Pete Samedi revealed the superhero and supervillain are trademark terms. So the thing about trademarking, not to get too deep into this, is that trademarks only hold as long as people respect them. So if you use superhero and someone sues you for using a trademark term, you took it to court and you're like, superhero is a generic term, that trademark would actually get thrown out. So just because somebody registers a trademark doesn't mean that they get to actually own it. That just means they registered it. And in fact, if they were to defend superhero and supervillain in court, they would absolutely lose, which is why you never see anyone get sued over it. So yeah, you can file a trademark. You can try to register a trademark. DC Comics owns superhero. It won't hold up in court though. Not superhero and supervillain. If you're doing something really specific, like because trademarks are about something that's associated with a company. So Magic the Gathering is trademarked, obviously. You couldn't call your game Magic something and have it be a card game. Magic is trademarked. Now, not Magic, infinite use of Magic, but Magic in the use of a collectible card game. So you could not call your card game Magic Unleashed. Sorry, Magic the Gathering has a trademark on Magic. What? I can't use the word magic in my book? Yes, you can. You can use the word magic in your book title, whatever you want. But you couldn't use it in the card game. And why? Because that would confuse consumers. They would see a game called Magic Unleashed and think that Wizards of the Coast had made another Magic card game, and therefore would think they were buying one product when they're really buying another. That's the whole purpose of trademark, right? Why can't you call your restaurant McDonald's? Because people will go into your McDonald's thinking it is a McDonald's store like the other McDonald's stores they've been in, and they may not get the food that they wanted, and it'll hurt the consumer possibly, right? You're duping the consumer. You're also like using McDonald's advertising to advertise your store, right? There's a problem with that. You're kind of leeching off their brand recognition. So that's the thing. So I don't think superhero and supervillain would stand up in court. Just because something is registered doesn't mean it'll stand up in court. Like if you were to register the trademark Comicsgate, it probably wouldn't stand up in court, guys. But people don't like to bother litigating because litigation's long, expensive, and painful. So chances are no one's going to litigate over superhero. But Disney could litigate over Wookiee, which is a trademark term, or Han Solo, which is a trademark term. They might litigate over that. If you had collectible card game, if you were somehow able to trademark that, people would just find another way to express what you're talking about outside that trademark, to just avoid the litigation. And if somebody really had the money, then they could just call it a CCG and say, oh, well, your trademark doesn't count because it's generic. And this has been a thing where like you can, Coke is almost a generic term, meaning, cola, soda. So trademarks are interesting. No one likes to litigate them because it's expensive and you actually don't know how they're going to pan out. It's why you see so few copyright suits is you actually don't know what the jury's going to say. And that doesn't give any lawyer any kind of confidence. Like, I have no idea. This could go either way. No matter how much you're in the right, the jury could decide against you. You just don't know. CDPR actually tried to trademark Cyberpunk during the development of the game. I don't remember if they actually did. I mean, I think you probably could. I think you can make a case that people would associate that. But because it's based on Cyberpunk 2020, I think Cyberpunk in the video game world, I think you'd have a good case for a trademark there. That if somebody saw another video game called Cyberpunk, they would think that CD Projekt Red was somehow involved or was somehow related to the CD Projekt Red game, which is very popular and sold many copies. Peter Cimetti says he knows several indie creators who got cease and desist letters for using Superhero, and when they got a project completely shut down for it. That may be true. It's probably because they didn't want to litigate it. You know what I mean? I'm not going to say whether that's true or not. It sounds a little too far-fetched. It'd be like trademarking fantasy. Yeah, who owns the trademark to Superhero? This is probably a troll. Do what we want, and then maybe we'll sue you, and then you'll try to settle out of court. It's like, I don't know. You know, it depends on your resources, whether you want to take things like that to the mattresses. I wonder what it will mean for the ISOM trademark fight. It's a kind of a stupid trademark fight, but the cheapest thing to do would be for Eric July to rebrand. And so that's usually what you do. You just do the cheap thing when you come into conflicts like that, because you just don't know how those things are going to pan out. Yeah, you just don't know. Especially with stuff like music, where songs can sound remarkably similar to each other unintentionally. Direct quote from Cimetti: Superhero, Superhero, and Supervillain, Supervillain are co-owned trademarks by Marvel and DC. I think they would have a hard time defending that in court, though. That's my point. So most people are scared of litigation, rightfully, because it's painful. But if you were to actually litigate that and be like, these are generic terms, you've never associated them with your brand appropriately. They're used. You haven't engaged in any kind of litigation against other people that have used them. Therefore, I think you don't actually, that trademark doesn't hold, and I'll see you in court. Because they'd be the ones filing suit. You know, your best countersuit, I don't know what your countersuit would be, you know. But I think you'd have a hard time getting it past motion to dismiss. Any judge would be like, Marvel and DC, but like superheroes are done by lots of people. Case dismissed. I don't think you'd get it past motion. I don't know. You never know. I'm not an attorney. I've studied a lot of IP law because it's in my business. I've been to like legal seminars on it, but I'm not an IP lawyer. I don't litigate this stuff. So I've talked to an IP expert, might be able to say it's just not worth the litigation most of the time. Right? It's not worth the litigation most of the time. Right? Anyway, I think that's about it for today. I'm out of time. Thank you guys so much for watching, talking to me, giving me feedback, talking about copyright, all kinds of other fun things. I will see you all next time. Have a great one. Patreon.com. I need to link my Patreon. David V. Stewart. It's in the show notes. I think that would be a hard trademark to defend, is superhero and supervillain. Really hard. It'd be like trying to defend hamburger. Maybe not as bad as hamburger. But, you know, Big Mac, we know that Big Mac is like a McDonald's thing, but hamburger's not. It's closer to hamburger than Big Mac, in my opinion. All right, there's my Patreon. Let me link my music channel. Got stuff going on there, of course. And I'll see you all next time.